The Amazon rainforest is not old. That is one of the strangest facts in all of biology. The trees, the vines, the suffocating green density of it, none of that existed 66 million years ago. Where the Amazon stands today, there was a completely different forest, open, bright, dominated by conifers and ferns. And then, in a single day, that forest was destroyed. Every tree, every plant, nearly half of all species in the tropics gone. But here is the part that scientists could not explain for decades. What grew back was not the same forest. It was not even close. Something else took its place, something so radically different that it changed the chemistry of the soil, the shape of the canopy, and the future of every living thing on the continent. And for a long time, no one knew why. Tonight, we are going to find out. But before we do, let me know in the comments, are you listening from home tonight, or do you have this playing somewhere else while your day is still going? Now, let us go back to the world that existed before the Amazon. Picture South America near the end of the Cretaceous, a continent wrapped in warmth for so long that the climate itself seemed woven into the fabric of the world. Across much of the Mesozoic, global temperatures stood roughly 4 to 12 degrees Celsius higher than those of the present day. Rain still fell across the tropics, rivers still crossed broad lowlands, and forests stretched across the landscape. Yet this was a forest that would feel unfamiliar to anyone expecting the Amazon. Light moved through it differently. Tree crowns stood apart from one another, leaving openings through which sunlight reached the ground with little resistance. Ferns, seedlings, and patches of vegetation occupied spaces that would later disappear beneath a dense roof of leaves. The forest lacked the layered architecture associated with modern tropical rainforests. There was no intricate vertical world, divided into distinct ecological levels. From canopy to soil, the structure remained comparatively open. Rising above much of this landscape were members of the Araucariaceae, a family of conifers whose lineage stretched deep into geological time. Their descendants still survive in scattered parts of South America today, carrying silhouettes that would have been recognizable tens of millions of years ago. During the late Cretaceous, these trees were among the principal architects of the tropical canopy. Their dominance shaped the appearance of the forest and influenced the ecological opportunities available beneath them. Flowering plants were already present, adding diversity to the vegetation, but they had not yet become the defining feature of tropical ecosystems. Angiosperms occupied portions of the canopy and undergrowth, though they remained a minority. Less than half of the canopy consisted of flowering plants. Conifers and ferns still held much of the ecological ground, preserving a balance that had endured across immense stretches of time. The soil contributed to that stability. Millions of years of warm, wet conditions had gradually stripped nutrients from the ground. Phosphorus and nitrogen, essential ingredients for rapid plant growth, were repeatedly washed away through long cycles of rainfall and weathering. Such conditions favored conifers, which could tolerate nutrient scarcity more effectively than many flowering plants. The chemistry of the soil reinforced the existing order, helping maintain a forest that changed only gradually across generations measured in millions of years. From the perspective of any living organism within it, this world would have appeared permanent. Forests had occupied these regions for ages beyond comprehension. Their composition shifted, species came and went, yet the broader structure endured. Nothing in the landscape suggested that an ecological transformation of extraordinary scale was approaching. Knowledge of this vanished forest comes from years of patient reconstruction. Researchers from the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute spent 12 years studying fossil evidence preserved in Colombian coal mines. More than 6,000 fossil leaves and 50,000 pollen grains were collected and analyzed. Each fragment served as a record of a plant that once lived beneath Cretaceous skies, allowing scientists to assemble a portrait of an ecosystem long erased from the surface of the Earth. That portrait revealed a forest unlike the one that would follow. When the boundary between worlds arrived, the change proved so profound that the researchers who traced it through stone and pollen described the outcome in unusual terms. They saw more than recovery. They saw the beginning of something entirely new. Chance governs more of Earth's history than it first appears. The asteroid that arrived at the end of the Cretaceous carried immense destructive power on its own, yet the scale of the extinction was shaped by something else as well. Its destination mattered. Had the same object arrived a few moments earlier or later in geological terms, striking a different region of the planet, the history of life might have unfolded along a very different path. The Yucatan Peninsula of the late Cretaceous occupied a shallow continental shelf bordering warm tropical seas. Beneath those waters lay thick layers of carbonate rock, sulfur rich evaporites, and sediments infused with hydrocarbons. For millions of years, these materials rested undisturbed, accumulating in a geological arrangement that happened to be exceptionally vulnerable to a high energy impact. The landscape contained ingredients that would become far more dangerous once released into the atmosphere. When the asteroid struck, the collision generated temperatures exceeding those found at the surface of the Sun. Rock ceased to behave like rock. Carbonates, evaporites, and buried sediments were vaporized almost instantly, transformed into expanding clouds of gas and debris. Massive quantities of sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide were blasted upward through the atmosphere and into the stratosphere. A comparable impact into granite bedrock or deep ocean crust would have produced a different atmospheric outcome. The composition of the target amplified the consequences far beyond the force of the collision itself. High above the surface, sulfur dioxide began reacting with water vapor and oxygen. The process created sulfuric acid aerosols, microscopic particles capable of remaining suspended for extended periods. These aerosols reflected incoming sunlight and contributed to the environmental upheaval that followed. They also became the source of acid rain that later fell across continents and oceans, altering ecosystems already under severe stress. Carbon dioxide followed a different path. While sulfur compounds promoted cooling in the immediate aftermath, carbon dioxide lingered as a greenhouse gas. As dust and aerosols gradually settled, its influence persisted within the atmosphere, helping drive a later phase of warming. The impact therefore initiated opposing climatic pressures, first dimming and cooling the planet, then contributing to a warmer world afterward. Computer models have explored alternative scenarios. Simulations suggest that an asteroid of identical size striking open ocean or more chemically ordinary crust would likely have caused a less severe extinction. Species losses would still have been profound, but the atmospheric chemistry would have been altered. The Yucatan happened to contain one of the most destructive combinations of geological materials available anywhere on Earth. Geometry added another layer to the catastrophe. Evidence indicates the asteroid approached at an angle between roughly 45 and 60 degrees. Such a trajectory proved highly effective at launching debris upward into the atmosphere. More material reached extreme altitudes than would have occurred during a steeper or shallower impact, extending the reach of the environmental consequences across the globe. The scar remains today. Buried beneath the Yucatan Peninsula in the Gulf of Mexico lies the Chicxulub crater, approximately 180 kilometers wide. Though concealed beneath younger rock, its outline emerges through gravitational and magnetic measurements, a lingering signature of a morning when location, chemistry, and angle aligned with extraordinary precision. Together, they produced the most destructive impact event of the past several hundred million years. Everything that follows begins within a span of time shorter than a human breath. The asteroid strikes the shallow waters of the Yucatan Shelf, carrying more energy than any volcanic eruption or earthquake in recorded history. In less than a second, it tears through the ocean, punches through the crust, and drives several kilometers into the mantle. Layers of rock assembled across hundreds of millions of years cease to exist as solid matter. Limestone, evaporites, sediments, seawater, and crust are converted into expanding clouds of gas, plasma, and molten debris. A cavity opens in the earth, then collapses almost immediately as surrounding material rushes inward. Minutes pass. Heat moves outward from the impact zone at extraordinary speed. Air compressed by the collision forms a thermal pulse racing across the landscape at roughly 600 miles per hour. Forests ignite, vegetation dries and burns before flames even arrive. Along the margins of the Gulf of Mexico, walls of water rise toward 100 meters in height and begin moving outward across coastlines and shallow seas. At the same time, a shock wave circles the planet, carrying the signature of the impact into regions thousands of kilometers away. Hours later, material launched skyward continues its journey. Billions of tons of dust, molten droplets, and vaporized crust spread through the upper atmosphere. Some fragments travel so high that they briefly enter orbital trajectories before falling back toward Earth. Their return transforms the sky. Countless particles streak through the atmosphere together, producing a global shower of incandescent debris. Heat generated during re entry spreads across enormous areas of the planet. Fires begin in places far removed from the crater itself, sparked from above rather than from the ground. Days unfold beneath a changing sky. Dust and smoke continue accumulating at high altitude. Ash from continental wildfires joins the growing atmospheric veil. Sunlight weakens, horizons fade. Across every continent, daylight loses its familiar brightness as the debris cloud spreads around the globe. Months bring a different form of destruction. Plants depend on sunlight to convert energy into growth, and the flow of that energy now falters. Photosynthesis declines across terrestrial and marine ecosystems. Temperatures fall as less solar radiation reaches the surface. Food webs begin failing from their foundations. Organisms that depend directly on plants struggle first. Predators follow. Ecological connections built over millions of years unravel in sequence. Years pass beneath altered skies. Sulfuric acid aerosols circulating through the atmosphere return to the surface as acid rain. Lakes, rivers, and wetlands absorb the chemical burden. Ocean chemistry shifts as well, adding stress to communities already weakened by darkness and cooling. Recovery remains distant. Survival itself becomes the defining challenge. Within a geologically brief interval, approximately 75% of all species disappear. Land ecosystems suffer especially severe losses. Only around 12% of terrestrial species endure. Persistence belongs largely to organisms capable of feeding on detritus, sheltering underground, or surviving long periods without fresh plant growth. Among those survivors are small mammals moving through debris strewn landscapes, a handful of bird lineages, and seeds resting in the soil. Their scale appears insignificant against the magnitude of the catastrophe. Yet within those scattered remnants, the future remains present, waiting through the long aftermath of the impact. Distance offered little protection. Looking at a map of the late Cretaceous world, It is tempting to imagine the tropical forests of South America escaping the worst effects of a catastrophe centered near the Yucatan Peninsula. Thousands of kilometers separated those forests from the crater. Rivers still wound through the continent. Rain still fell from tropical skies. Geography seems to suggest survival. The fossil record tells a different story. Researchers studying sediments that span the boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene periods found an abrupt disappearance of plant diversity throughout the tropical regions of South America. The evidence comes from pollen, each grain carrying the distinctive characteristics of the plant that produced it. Viewed under a microscope, pollen functions almost like a biological signature. Some signatures continue upward through younger layers of rock. Others reach the boundary and end. From these records, scientists estimate that approximately 45% of tropical plant species vanished. A number on its own can feel abstract. The living forest experienced that loss through relationships. Tropical ecosystems are woven from countless connections linking plants, insects, fungi, animals, and microbes. Every species participates in exchanges of food, reproduction, shelter, or nutrient cycling. When nearly half of the plant species disappear within a geologically brief interval, those connections break apart. Pollinators lose food sources, seed dispersers lose fruiting plants, organisms adapted to specific hosts find themselves without hosts at all. Absence spreads through the system as effectively as presence once did. The landscape left behind bore little resemblance to the thriving forests that had occupied the continent before the impact. Fire had passed through many regions, darkness and cooling followed. Acid precipitation altered soils and freshwater habitats. Root systems remained in the ground, but many no longer connected to living plants above. Across broad areas, ecological activity slowed dramatically. The structure of the old forest dissolved faster than a replacement could emerge. Into that opening came an unexpected pioneer. Ferns appeared in extraordinary abundance. Their arrival is recorded so consistently across the world that paleobotanists refer to it as the fern spike. In sedimentary layers immediately above the boundary, fern spores often dominate the fossil record. The pattern appears in North America, Europe, Asia, and the tropics of South America. Wherever the catastrophe erased established vegetation, ferns expanded into the available space. Their success came from traits shaped long before the impact. Ferns reproduce through lightweight spores, capable of traveling widely. They establish quickly on disturbed ground and tolerate environmental instability that prevents many other plants from gaining a foothold. For a brief interval after the extinction, landscapes that had once supported diverse forests became territories where ferns flourished almost alone. Recovery moved at a pace measured in millions of years. Plant diversity in the tropics did not return to pre impact levels for more than 6 million years. To place that span in perspective, 6 million years ago, the evolutionary line leading to modern humans had not yet separated from the ancestors of chimpanzees. Entire chapters of mammalian history fit within the duration of that botanical recovery. The pollen record reveals that life returned, species accumulated, and forests expanded once more. What emerged from those millions of years, however, carried a composition unlike the world that had been lost. The numbers recover, the identities do not. Extinction often appears chaotic when viewed from a distance. Species vanish, ecosystems collapse, and entire branches of life disappear from the record. Looking closer, patterns emerge. Survival is rarely distributed evenly. Certain organisms persist, while others decline, and those differences can shape the course of millions of years that follow. The tropical forests at the end of the Cretaceous offer a striking example. Among the hardest hit groups were the Araucariaceae, the conifer family that had long occupied a central role in the canopy. For tens of millions of years, these trees had flourished across warm regions of the world. Their lineage had endured shifting continents, changing climates, and countless generations of ecological competition. When the boundary event arrived, their dominance unraveled with surprising speed. Part of the explanation lies in specialization. Successful species often become finely tuned to the environments that support them. Through long periods of stability, natural selection favors adaptations that match particular combinations of light, temperature, moisture, and soil chemistry. The Araucariaceae had evolved within such conditions. Their success depended on ecological settings that remained relatively predictable across vast spans of time. When those conditions changed abruptly, the advantages that once supported them became constraints. A species adapted to a narrow range of circumstances has fewer options when the world shifts around it. Migration requires suitable habitat elsewhere. Adaptation requires time. The aftermath of the impact provided little of either. Forest structure changed, nutrient cycles faltered, and climatic conditions fluctuated beyond the ranges to which many conifers had become accustomed. Flowering plants entered the crisis carrying a different set of traits. Angiosperms occupied a broad variety of habitats even before the extinction. Some tolerated disturbed ground. Others grew across different soil conditions or endured wider temperature ranges. Diversity itself became an advantage. Within the angiosperms existed many strategies for surviving environmental instability, increasing the likelihood that at least some lineages would persist. Their resilience extended into genetics as well. Many flowering plant groups possess a greater capacity for whole genome duplication, a process in which an organism carries additional copies of its genetic material. Over evolutionary time, duplicated genes can acquire new functions or provide flexibility during periods of environmental stress. Such mechanisms do not guarantee survival, yet they expand the range of biological possibilities available when circumstances change rapidly. As millions of plants lived or died across post-impact landscapes, these differences accumulated. Conifers remained present in some regions, but their dominance within tropical forests collapsed. Angiosperms suffered losses of their own, though enough survived to maintain a foothold. The balance that had characterized the old ecosystem no longer existed. Among the surviving flowering plants were species capable of colonizing open terrain, dispersing seeds across damaged landscapes, and growing rapidly when conditions allowed. Some produced abundant fruit. Others reproduced efficiently after disturbance. Many tolerated soils altered by fire, chemical change, and ecological disruption. Their strengths happened to align with the realities of the world that followed the extinction. Nothing in this process reflected purpose or foresight. No ecological law selected a future winner. Statistical probability operating across millions of individual lives produced the outcome. The dominant trees of the former forest faded from prominence. Their successors remained scattered across recovering landscapes, present but not yet ascendant, occupying a world still being reshaped by consequences that extended far beyond the extinction itself. A forest is shaped not only by the plants that grow within it, but also by the animals that move through it. This idea becomes easier to see when standing beside a modern elephant trail. Trees lie broken, saplings disappear beneath heavy feet. Open spaces persist year after year because large herbivores continuously interrupt the growth of vegetation. The landscape reflects the habits of the animals living inside it. During the late Cretaceous, tropical ecosystems were influenced by a similar force operating on a far larger scale. Great herds of herbivorous dinosaurs crossed floodplains, forests, and river margins throughout much of the world. Hadrosaurs, including animals such as Edmontosaurus, traveled in groups numbering from dozens to perhaps hundreds. Ceratopsians, such as Triceratops, consumed enormous quantities of plant material each day. Individual animals weighed several tons. Collectively, they represented a level of ecological pressure difficult to imagine in modern ecosystems. Their influence extended beyond feeding. As herds moved across the landscape, young trees were crushed before reaching maturity. Shrubs and seedlings disappeared beneath constant grazing. Branches snapped. Vegetation struggled to establish uninterrupted growth. Openings formed within the canopy and remained present through repeated disturbance. Every journey through a forest altered the physical structure of that forest. Ecologists describe such organisms as ecosystem engineers, species whose activities modify habitats in ways that affect countless other forms of life. The dinosaurs filling this role were not intentionally managing forests. Their daily search for food produced the effect automatically. Generation after generation, their movements helped maintain environments that remained comparatively open. Evidence of this influence appears in an unexpected place: rivers. Research published in 2025 in Communications, Earth and Environment examined changes in river systems before and after the extinction. The geological record preserves the shapes of ancient waterways through layers of sediment deposited across millions of years. Cretaceous rivers often appear broad, braided, and unstable. Multiple channels split apart and rejoined repeatedly, carrying sediment across wide floodplains. Riverbanks shifted frequently because vegetation struggled to anchor them in place. After the extinction, a different pattern emerged. Waterways became narrower and more meandering. Channels stabilized. Organic material accumulated along their margins. Coal deposits began appearing more commonly in these environments, indicating landscapes where plant matter could build up and remain undisturbed. The transformation suggests that vegetation became denser and more continuous than before. Modern Africa provides a useful parallel. In regions where elephant populations decline, woodlands often expand into areas that had remained open for decades. Without continual trampling and browsing, young trees survive at higher rates. Growth accumulates. The structure of the habitat changes. 66 million years ago, every large non-avian dinosaur disappeared within a geologically brief interval. No replacement existed. The pressure that had repeatedly interrupted forest development vanished across the planet at once. Seedlings encountered fewer obstacles. Saplings reached greater heights. Vegetation began filling spaces that had long remained open. For the first time in tropical history, the canopy gained an opportunity to knit itself together without interference from giant herbivores. Conditions alone could not guarantee that outcome. Plants still needed the traits required to seize the opportunity. The extinction had removed the architects of openness, leaving behind a landscape ready for a different design. Among the many consequences of the impact, one stands apart for its irony. The same collision that shattered ecosystems across the planet also altered the chemical foundation of the world left behind. While forests disappeared, rivers changed course, and food webs collapsed. Another process unfolded high in the atmosphere. Material excavated from the impact site began a journey that would eventually touch nearly every continent on Earth. The asteroid struck rocks rich in carbonates and sulfates, blasting enormous quantities of pulverized material upward. Dust, vapor, and mineral particles rose through the atmosphere and spread across the globe. This was not a local event confined to the crater region. Winds carried the debris across oceans and continents, distributing it far beyond the Yucatan Peninsula. Over months and years, gravity gradually returned that material to the surface. Each falling particle added to a planetary scale shower of minerals. Tropical South America received its share. Regions that had already endured fire, cooling, darkness, and ecological collapse now experienced a subtle chemical transformation. The process occurred grain by grain, almost imperceptibly at any single location, yet, across entire landscapes, the cumulative effect became significant. Wildfires contributed to the change as well. Vegetation burned on a global scale during the aftermath of the impact, leaving behind ash enriched with phosphorus and other nutrients released from plant tissues. Atmospheric circulation dispersed this ash over large distances before it settled back onto land and water. The products of destruction became ingredients for renewal. Evidence of this fallout remains preserved in stone. At sites marking the boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene periods, geologists consistently find a thin layer enriched in iridium. This element is uncommon within Earth's crust, but relatively abundant in many asteroids. The iridium layer appears across the world, from marine sediments to continental deposits, providing a chemical signature of material delivered during the impact event. It serves as a planetary timestamp, recording the moment when extraterrestrial debris became part of Earth's surface. Within tropical soils, the influx of nutrients produced effects that extended beyond simple fertilization. Prior to the extinction, nutrient scarcity had shaped ecological competition for millions of years. Phosphorus and nitrogen were often limited, favoring plant groups adapted to persistent shortages. Such conditions had helped sustain the dominance of conifers within many tropical forests. The post-impact nutrient pulse altered that balance. Phosphorus availability increased. Nitrogen levels rose. Soil conditions shifted away from the constraints that had previously governed plant growth. Ecological advantages accumulated in different places than before. Carlos Jaramillo, one of the lead researchers behind the landmark 2021 study of tropical fossil records, summarized the effect succinctly. As soon as nutrients entered the soil, flowering plants could grow far faster than conifers, leaving the older canopy builders unable to compete on equal terms. What emerged was a convergence of circumstances unlike anything the tropics had experienced. The dominant conifers had largely disappeared. The giant herbivores that once interrupted forest growth were gone. Nutrient-poor soils had received a substantial infusion of mineral resources. Conditions that had remained separated for millions of years now existed together. A rock from space had ended one world. In doing so, it had also rewritten the rules governing the ground from which the next world would grow. Across tropical South America, countless seeds lay scattered through soils that had endured fire, darkness, chemical change, and years of ecological instability. Most would never germinate, some would. Those survivors inherited a landscape unlike any their ancestors had known. The ground offered opportunities that had been rare in the older world. Open space stretched across recovering ecosystems. Nutrients circulated through soils in greater abundance than before. The towering conifers that once dominated large portions of the canopy had largely vanished from competition. Massive herbivores no longer crossed the landscape, interrupting vegetation before it matured. Conditions favored plants capable of responding rapidly. Flowering plants possessed precisely those abilities. Under nutrient-rich circumstances, Angiosperms grow with a speed that many conifers cannot match. Their tissues transport water efficiently. Their leaves convert sunlight into energy at high rates. Seedlings establish themselves quickly after disturbance. In ecological contests where reaching sunlight determines success, these characteristics create a substantial advantage. A young angiosperm can achieve in years what some conifers require decades to accomplish. As recovery progressed, growth accelerated across the tropics. Saplings competed for light, crowns expanded, roots spread through soils, still carrying the chemical legacy of the impact. Each season rewarded plants capable of adding height faster than their neighbors. The competition unfolded gradually on human timescales, yet appears abrupt when compressed into geological history. Evidence of the transformation survives in pollen. Before the boundary event, conifer pollen dominated many tropical deposits. Above that boundary, the proportions begin shifting. Layer after layer records an increasing presence of flowering plants. Through time, angiosperm pollen rises until it accounts for more than 96% of the tropical canopy. The reversal is extraordinary. A botanical minority became the defining component of an entire biome. This change involved more than replacing one group of trees with another. The character of the forest itself began to transform. Flowering plants brought forms uncommon in the older ecosystem. Many developed broad crowns, capable of intercepting large amounts of sunlight. Leaves widened, capturing energy efficiently, while casting deeper shade across the ground. Branching patterns diversified. Forest architecture grew more varied as different species explored different strategies for occupying space. Fruit production expanded as well. Flowers and fruits represented investments in reproduction that connected plants more closely to animals. Resources appeared in greater abundance and greater variety than before. Ecological interactions multiplied alongside the vegetation creating them. Below ground, root systems extended through sediments and floodplains. Networks of roots stabilized soil, reduced erosion, and altered how water moved through the landscape. Areas once prone to frequent disturbance became increasingly anchored by living structures. Growth above the surface depended on support below it, and both expanded together. The competition still appeared to concern height. Trees rose towards sunlight, while neighboring trees attempted the same. A deeper process was unfolding. Each successful crown occupied space permanently enough to influence conditions around it. Shade increased, air circulation changed, moisture lingered longer among leaves and branches. Every expanding tree modified the environment encountered by the next generation. Gradually, the spaces between crowns narrowed. Gaps that had once allowed sunlight to flood the ground became less common. Branches approached one another from different directions until separate trees began forming a continuous roof above the forest floor. The race for the sky was approaching a threshold where growth itself would begin reshaping the climate inside the forest. The transformation did not arrive with a single species or a single moment. It emerged from countless branches, expanding outward until neighboring crowns finally touched. Across tropical South America, tree after tree extended into available space, and eventually the gaps that had defined the older landscape began to disappear. Sunlight that once traveled freely to the ground encountered a living ceiling. That ceiling changed everything. When crowns interlock, a forest becomes more than a collection of trees. It becomes its own environment. Most incoming sunlight never reaches the soil. Leaves high above intercept nearly all available energy, leaving only a small fraction to filter downward. At ground level, illumination can fall to 1 or 2% of what strikes the upper canopy. Conditions that were once bright and exposed become shaded and subdued. Moisture responds as well. Water released through leaves accumulates within the forest rather than dispersing rapidly into open air. Humidity remains elevated through much of the day and night. Temperatures fluctuate less dramatically. Daytime heat is moderated by layers of vegetation overhead, while nighttime cooling proceeds more gradually. Air movement weakens close to the ground because trunks, branches, and foliage interrupt the flow of wind. The result was a habitat unlike the one that had preceded it. Earlier tropical forests had contained wider openings, stronger light at ground level, and greater exposure to seasonal variation. The newly forming canopy created stable internal conditions that persisted across large areas. Organisms living within those conditions encountered opportunities and challenges that previous ecosystems rarely offered. As structure increased, the forest acquired depth. A tree growing near the top of the canopy occupied a world entirely different from one rooted below. Above the canopy stood emergent giants exposed to full sunlight. Beneath them stretched the canopy layer itself, dense with leaves and branches. Lower still existed a middle zone receiving filtered light. Closer to the ground, an understory developed where shade-tolerant plants found refuge. At the base lay the forest floor, covered with decomposing organic matter and sustained by energy descending from above. Each level demanded different adaptations. Some plants specialized in capturing intense sunlight. Others evolved to persist with only traces of it. Different growth forms, leaf shapes, reproductive strategies, and ecological relationships appeared as organisms occupied positions throughout this vertical landscape. Evidence for this transformation remains preserved within fossil leaves. Researchers studying carbon isotope ratios discovered that leaves from open canopy environments tend to record relatively similar patterns because sunlight exposure is broadly comparable. In forests with multiple layers, light availability varies dramatically from top to bottom. Leaves formed at different heights therefore carry different isotopic signatures. Through the Paleocene record, that variation becomes increasingly pronounced, revealing the gradual construction of a stratified forest. New ecological space emerged wherever those layers developed. Additional habitats meant additional opportunities for specialization. Species could occupy positions separated by meters rather than kilometers. Life no longer spread only across the landscape. It expanded upward and downward through it. The forest had become an architecture of living levels, a structure capable of supporting forms of diversity that earlier tropical ecosystems could not sustain. Every branch, leaf, and layer contributed to a world whose complexity now depended on a constant exchange between vegetation and the atmosphere surrounding it. Many of the plants reshaping the recovering tropics drew attention through size. They rose into the canopy, spread broad crowns, and altered the architecture of the forest itself. Another group worked through a different strategy. Their influence unfolded largely out of sight, carried through roots, microbes, and chemical exchanges taking place within the soil. These were the legumes, the plant family known today as Fabaceae. They do not appear as significant players in Cretaceous tropical forests. Their rise belongs to the world that emerged after the extinction. Fossil evidence places them within ecosystems already undergoing profound transformation, arriving during a period when nutrient cycles, vegetation structure, and biological relationships were being rebuilt from the ground upward. Their importance came from a capability possessed by very few plants: Nitrogen surrounds every living thing. It fills the atmosphere in immense quantities, yet most organisms cannot use it directly. Plants require nitrogen to build proteins, enzymes, and the machinery of growth, but atmospheric nitrogen remains chemically inaccessible to them. Legumes solve this problem through partnership. Within specialized nodules growing along their roots lived colonies of bacteria capable of capturing atmospheric nitrogen and converting it into compounds plants could use. The relationship benefited both participants. The bacteria received energy and shelter. The plant gained access to one of the most valuable nutrients in nature. In tropical ecosystems, this ability carried enormous consequences. Warm and wet environments recycle nutrients rapidly. Material falls to the forest floor, decomposes, and is absorbed again with remarkable efficiency. Even so, nitrogen often remains one of the major constraints on plant growth. During the Paleocene, ecosystems recovering from mass extinction faced the additional challenge of rebuilding disrupted nutrient networks. Biological communities were expanding into ecological space that had been emptied only a few million years earlier. Legumes entered that setting as nutrient producers. Every season, their bacterial partners transferred usable nitrogen into living tissues and surrounding soils. Leaves fell, roots decayed, organic matter accumulated. Nutrients entered circulation where neighboring plants could access them. The process operated continuously, generation after generation, across landscapes growing increasingly rich in vegetation. A single legume tree affected more than itself. Nearby plants benefited from enhanced soil fertility. Seedlings established more successfully. Growth rates increased. Communities capable of supporting greater diversity gradually emerged around these nutrient sources. The influence extended far beyond the boundaries of any individual plant. Across millions of years, legumes became woven into the foundation of the forest. They functioned as biological infrastructure, maintaining fertility in ecosystems whose productivity depended on constant nutrient turnover. Their contribution lacked the visual drama of towering trees or flowering canopies, yet many of those visible features relied upon processes legumes helped sustain. Today, members of the Fabaceae family rank among the most successful plants in the Amazon. Their prominence reflects more than survival or competitive strength. They participate directly in the nutrient economy that supports countless other species. Forest productivity, soil fertility, and biological diversity all intersect with the services they provide. The mineral-rich fallout from the impact had supplied an initial boost to recovering soils. Legumes prolonged that recovery and carried it forward through deep time. Nutrients delivered from the sky became nutrients generated from within the ecosystem itself. A temporary pulse evolved into a self-renewing process. By this stage, the forest had acquired layered habitats, expanding vegetation, and increasingly fertile ground. Life was multiplying opportunities for other life, and along the trunks, leaves, roots, and branches of this growing world, new occupants were beginning to answer that invitation. A leaf can preserve more than the memory of a plant. Across Paleocene rock formations, fossil leaves carry scars, tunnels, punctures, swollen growths, and carefully traced feeding paths. To a casual observer, they may appear random. To paleontologists, they are records of vanished lives. Each mark identifies an interaction between a plant and an insect, preserving evidence of relationships that unfolded tens of millions of years ago. Those records reveal a striking pattern. Above the boundary that marks the end of the Cretaceous, the variety of insect damage increases dramatically. Scientists do not merely find more feeding traces, they find different kinds of feeding traces. New patterns appear alongside older ones, indicating that insects were diversifying into an expanding range of ecological roles. Some species mined through the interior tissues of leaves, creating winding tunnels between surface layers. Others stimulated plants to grow protective structures known as galls, turning leaf tissue into specialized shelters. Certain insects fed along the margins, removing neat sections from the edges. Others pierced leaves to extract fluids directly from plant vessels. Every feeding style reflects a distinct evolutionary strategy, and each strategy points to a lineage adapting to particular resources. The growing diversity of flowering plants provided those resources in abundance. A forest dominated by angiosperms offered opportunities that earlier ecosystems had supplied only sparingly. Different leaf chemistries, growth forms, reproductive structures, and seasonal cycles created a far wider menu of ecological possibilities. As plant diversity expanded, insects encountered an increasing number of niches. Natural selection favored specialization. Lineages adapted to particular hosts, particular tissues, and sometimes even particular stages of plant growth. This relationship worked in both directions. More plant species created more opportunities for insects. More insect species generated new pressures on plants. Leaves evolved chemical defenses. Flowers evolved signals that attracted beneficial visitors. Fruits evolved traits encouraging consumption and dispersal. Every adaptation altered the environment experienced by the other side of the relationship. The interaction became a feedback system. Flowering plants introduced structures that transformed the nature of insect evolution. Flowers offered nectar and pollen. Fruits provided energy-rich rewards. These resources encouraged repeated contact between plants and animals. Pollination relationships grew increasingly intricate as both participants adapted to one another through countless generations. Bees, beetles, flies, wasps, butterflies, and many other groups diversified alongside the vegetation surrounding them. Changes in flower shape influenced feeding behavior. Variations in feeding behavior favored new anatomical traits. Mouth parts lengthened, sensory systems sharpened, and foraging strategies diversified. Evolution on one side encouraged evolution on the other. No single event caused this expansion. It accumulated gradually through millions of interactions repeated across millions of organisms. A new plant species created opportunities for insects. New insects altered selective pressures acting on plants. Those altered plants generated additional opportunities, and the cycle continued. By this stage, the recovering forest was no longer rebuilding itself through simple replacement. It was generating novelty. Diversity was beginning to produce additional diversity. The modern Amazon contains an estimated 2.5 million insect species. That richness emerged through a process measured not in centuries, but in tens of millions of years. Each generation inherited a world slightly more complex than the one before it. Every successful adaptation added another thread to an expanding ecological web. Once that process gained momentum, growth no longer depended solely on recovery from extinction. Life itself became the engine, creating conditions for more life, and the forest entered a phase of compounding complexity that would continue across deep time. Rivers are often treated as architects of landscapes. They carve valleys, transport sediment, and determine where ecosystems take root. In the recovering tropics of South America, something unusual happened. The relationship began running in both directions. As the new forests expanded, the rivers themselves started to change. The evidence appears in stone long before it appears in the living world. Sedimentary deposits from the late Cretaceous reveal waterways that behaved very differently from those familiar today. Channels spread widely across floodplains. Water divided repeatedly into branching networks. Riverbanks shifted frequently. Sediment accumulated in broad sheets as streams abandoned one course and adopted another. Geologists describe these systems as braided rivers. They are dynamic, mobile, and difficult to stabilize. Their channels split apart and reconnect constantly, redistributing water and sediment across large areas. Such rivers are common where vegetation struggles to anchor the landscape. The tropical rivers of the Cretaceous displayed precisely those characteristics. Rock layers from that period preserve wide channel deposits, evidence of frequent flooding, and signs of repeated lateral migration. Water moved through an environment where extensive root networks were largely absent from river margins. Banks eroded easily. Sediment traveled freely. The landscape remained in motion. As the Paleocene progressed, the geological record began recording something different. Channels narrowed. River paths curved into sweeping bends. Sediment accumulated in more organized patterns. Wetlands persisted long enough for thick organic deposits to build up. Coal seams appear with increasing frequency, marking places where plant material accumulated year after year without being stripped away by shifting waterways. These changes occurred alongside the spread of the closed canopy forest. Roots played a central role. Dense vegetation extended through floodplains and along river margins. Trees anchored themselves deeply into the ground, binding soil particles together and increasing resistance to erosion. Networks of roots acted like living reinforcement structures, holding banks in place even during periods of elevated flow. Vegetation also influenced how water moved across the surface. Rainfall encountered leaves, trunks, and forest litter before reaching the ground. Flow became less abrupt. Sediment transport slowed. Riverbanks experienced fewer disturbances. Conditions increasingly favored stability. Another factor contributed to the transformation. The giant herbivores that had once disrupted vegetation were gone. Without continual trampling, browsing, and physical disturbance, plant communities maintained continuous cover along waterways. Root systems remained intact across large areas, strengthening the effect. Gradually, rivers responded. Instead of wandering broadly across floodplains, many channels settled into more predictable courses. Meanders developed, wetlands persisted, organic matter accumulated. The physical behavior of entire drainage systems shifted because the surrounding forest had changed. The consequences extended far beyond local streams. The modern Amazon River drains a basin comparable in size to the continental United States. It carries roughly one-fifth of all liquid freshwater flowing into the world's oceans. From the Andes Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean, its course stretches approximately 4,000 miles. Its familiar meanders, floodplains, and stable channels are products of processes that began when the post-extinction forest transformed the landscape around it. The river and the forest became partners in shaping one another. Roots stabilized banks. Stable banks supported wetlands. Wetlands encouraged further vegetation growth. Each component reinforced the next. Over millions of years, the relationship deepened until separating the history of the river from the history of the forest became nearly impossible. The forest was no longer adapting to the environment around it. It had become a force capable of reshaping the physical geography of an entire continent, extending its influence from the soil beneath its roots toward the atmosphere above its crown. A forest can influence rainfall around it. The Amazon eventually crossed a far more significant threshold. It became large enough to influence rainfall because of itself. By the time the Great Tropical Canopy had spread across much of northern South America, hundreds of millions of years of ecological change had produced a system unlike anything that had existed before. Trees covered immense distances without interruption. Roots occupied the soil continuously. Leaves formed a living surface stretching toward the horizon. At that scale, the forest was no longer responding only to climate. It had begun participating in its creation. Every tree moves water. Moisture enters through roots, travels upward through microscopic vessels, and exits through tiny openings in leaves. This process, known as transpiration, is active and continuous. Water is pulled skyward through differences in pressure between roots buried in the ground and leaves exposed to the atmosphere. A single tree can release substantial quantities of water vapor during its lifetime. Multiply that process across an entire continent spanning forest, and the numbers become difficult to imagine. The modern Amazon contains approximately 390 billion trees. Together, they transfer immense volumes of water from soil to air every day. The atmosphere above the forest becomes charged with moisture generated by the vegetation itself. Winds then transport that moisture across enormous distances. Scientists refer to these atmospheric flows as flying rivers. They are invisible waterways suspended above the canopy, streams of water vapor moving through the sky, much as liquid rivers move across the land. Measurements indicate that these airborne currents can transport more water than the Amazon River carries toward the Atlantic Ocean below. One river flows through channels carved into the earth. The other travels overhead, held aloft by air currents and sustained by countless leaves. The consequences extend far beyond the forest. Rain generated through this moisture cycle falls back onto the Amazon, replenishing the very trees that release the vapor. Additional moisture continues southward and westward across South America, supporting rainfall in regions far removed from the forest itself. Some studies suggest atmospheric connections reaching across the Atlantic Ocean toward parts of Africa, linking distant climates through the movement of water. An elegant cycle emerged. Roots draw water upward. Leaves release vapor. Vapor forms clouds. Clouds return rain. Rain replenishes rivers and groundwater. The process begins again. Each component strengthens the next, creating a self-reinforcing system that helps maintain warm, wet conditions across a vast region. This mechanism contributes directly to the extraordinary diversity of life found within the forest. Stable moisture levels reduce environmental stress. Rainfall remains comparatively reliable. Ecological communities can persist long enough for new species to emerge and specialize. The climate inside the forest becomes partially insulated from short-term fluctuations beyond its boundaries. Such a system depends on scale. A smaller forest cannot generate enough atmospheric moisture to sustain flying rivers of meaningful size. The process becomes powerful only when vegetation covers immense areas. Once that threshold is crossed, the forest effectively helps water itself. The same feedback can operate in reverse. Reduced forest cover means reduced transpiration. Less vapor leads to fewer clouds. Fewer clouds bring less rainfall. Drier conditions make it harder for forests to persist. The cycle weakens through the same mechanisms that once strengthened it. The Amazon required millions of years to reach the size necessary for this transformation. In doing so, it became more than a collection of trees. It became a climate system woven into the atmosphere itself, sustained by the scale of its own living architecture. The story of the Amazon's transformation survives today through traces so small that most could rest unnoticed on the tip of a finger. No observer witnessed the forest change. No record was written as flowering plants overtook conifers or as the canopy closed above the recovering tropics. Everything known about that transition had to be recovered from fragments buried deep within the earth, preserved across tens of millions of years, and waiting for someone to learn how to read them. That effort reached a landmark in April of 2021 with the publication of a study in the journal Science led by Monica Carvalho and Carlos Jaramillo of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama. Their goal was ambitious. They wanted to understand what tropical South America looked like before the extinction, what happened during the catastrophe, and how the forest that followed became something entirely different. To answer those questions, the research team turned to rock formations in Colombia that spanned a critical interval between roughly 72 million and 58 million years ago. These layers captured the closing chapter of the Cretaceous, the extinction boundary itself, and the first millions of years of the Paleocene. Running through the middle was the geological line marking the impact event, a thin division separating two radically different worlds. The work demanded patience measured in years. Over a period of 12 years, researchers collected more than 6,000 fossil leaves and 50,000 fossil pollen grains. Each specimen represented a tiny piece of evidence. Individually, a single leaf or grain revealed little. Together, they formed a record detailed enough to reconstruct an ecosystem that no longer existed. Pollen proved especially valuable. Its outer wall is extraordinarily durable, allowing it to survive conditions that destroy most organic material. Different plant groups produce pollen with distinctive shapes, textures, and structures. Viewed under a microscope, the differences are as recognizable as fingerprints. By identifying pollen species within successive layers of rock, scientists could determine which plants occupied the forest at different moments in time and track how their abundance changed across the extinction boundary. Leaves provided another line of evidence. Researchers measured the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 preserved within fossil tissues. That ratio carries information about the amount of sunlight a leaf received while alive. In an open forest, leaves experience similar light conditions, producing relatively consistent values. A closed forest creates strong contrasts between sunlit crowns and shaded lower layers, generating a much wider spread of isotope ratios. The Paleocene fossils revealed exactly that pattern, showing the emergence of a vertically structured canopy after the extinction. The leaves carried another record as well. Insects leave characteristic feeding marks when they chew edges, mine tunnels, pierce tissues, form galls, or extract sap. Each damage type reflects a different ecological strategy. By cataloging these signatures, researchers could estimate insect diversity without finding the insects themselves. The Paleocene assemblages displayed a striking expansion in feeding variety, matching the broader ecological diversification already unfolding within the forest. Perhaps the clearest signal came from the pollen counts. Below the extinction boundary, conifer pollen dominated the record. Above it, flowering plant pollen steadily rose until it became overwhelmingly prevalent. The shift appeared repeatedly across samples and locations, forming a pattern too consistent to dismiss. The Colombian coal mines preserved more than fossils. They preserved a detailed portrait of one of the most profound ecological transformations in Earth's history, recorded grain by grain, leaf by leaf, across the passage from one world into another. Viewed from enough distance, the emergence of the modern Amazon begins to look less like a single event and more like the unlikely intersection of several separate histories. Each thread was independent, each had its own cause, yet all of them converged within the same narrow window of geological time, creating conditions that had never existed before in the tropical world. The first thread was selective extinction. The catastrophe at the end of the Cretaceous did not erase life evenly. Some groups suffered far more than others. Among the plants, the dominant tropical conifers were especially vulnerable. For tens of millions of years, they had prospered under familiar conditions, occupying ecological roles that changed very little across generations. Their success depended on stability. When stability vanished, that dependence became a weakness. Flowering plants entered the crisis from a different position. They occupied a wider range of environments and possessed greater flexibility in how they reproduced, dispersed, and adapted. Many were damaged by the extinction, yet enough survived to carry their lineages forward. When the dust began to settle, the former rulers of the canopy had declined, while their long-standing competitors remained. The balance of power had shifted. A second process unfolded at the same time. For millions of years before the impact, tropical soils had been heavily weathered and nutrient poor. Those conditions favored the slow-growing conifers that already dominated the landscape. Then the asteroid struck. Mineral-rich dust entered the atmosphere. Ash from continent-scale wildfires spread across the planet. Material originating from both Earth and asteroid settled back onto the surface. The result was a temporary but significant enrichment of tropical soils. Phosphorus, nitrogen, and other nutrients became more available than they had been for ages. In that altered environment, flowering plants possessed a powerful advantage. They could grow rapidly, exploit disturbed ground, and convert resources into new growth at a pace conifers struggled to match. The competitive rules changed almost overnight in geological terms. A third factor emerged from absence. Before the extinction, large herbivorous dinosaurs continuously reshaped the landscape. Their feeding, movement, and trampling prevented vegetation from remaining undisturbed for long periods. Young trees faced constant pressure. Open spaces persisted across broad areas. When those animals disappeared, that pressure disappeared with them. For the first time, surviving vegetation could expand upward without repeated disruption from multi-ton herbivores. Crowns spread wider. Saplings survived in greater numbers. Forest structure became denser with each passing generation. Eventually, the canopy closed, and the layered architecture of the modern tropical rainforest began to emerge. Each mechanism reinforced the others. Without the collapse of the dominant conifers, flowering plants may never have gained control of the canopy. Without the nutrient pulse, their expansion could have slowed before reaching transformative scale. Without the disappearance of the great herbivores, new growth would have faced continual disturbance. Remove any one of those conditions, and the trajectory changes. Together, they produced something extraordinary. The same impact that extinguished entire ecosystems also aligned a chain of consequences that favored a radically different future. From one morning of destruction came the foundations of a forest more diverse, more layered, and more ecologically intricate than the one that preceded it. This was never a simple recovery. It was the accidental construction of a new world. For more than 100 million years, mammals lived in the shadow of another dynasty. They were present throughout the age of dinosaurs, surviving continental breakups, climate shifts, and ecological upheavals, yet they rarely occupied center stage. Most remained small. Many were active after dusk, Their lives unfolded within the spaces that larger animals ignored or could not easily exploit. While dinosaurs expanded into giant herbivores, apex predators, long-necked browsers, and swift runners, mammals persisted along the margins, diverse but constrained. By the final chapters of the Cretaceous, that pattern still held. The largest known mammals were modest creatures, roughly comparable in size to a modern badger. They could climb, burrow, hunt insects, or feed opportunistically, but none approached the scale of the dominant reptiles surrounding them. The world offered opportunities, yet nearly all of the major ecological roles were already occupied. Then the boundary arrived. The extinction removed the largest competitors, the largest herbivores, and the largest predators almost simultaneously. Ecological space opened across entire continents. Food sources became available. Habitats stood vacant. Evolutionary possibilities that had remained inaccessible for millions of generations suddenly became attainable. The response was astonishingly rapid. Within roughly 10 to 15 million years, mammals diversified into an extraordinary array of forms. Some lineages returned to the water and eventually gave rise to whales. Others took to the air and became bats. Ancestors of horses appeared. Early elephant relatives emerged. Odd-toed and even-toed ungulates expanded into new grazing and browsing roles. Carnivorous forms evolved to occupy predator niches. Burrowers, climbers, swimmers, and runners multiplied across the recovering world. Paleontologists often describe this period as one of the fastest morphological radiations in vertebrate history. The speed becomes easier to appreciate when viewed against the preceding 100 million years. Mammals had spent an immense stretch of time existing within narrow limits. Once those limits disappeared, evolution explored possibilities with extraordinary energy. The transformation was especially significant in the tropical forests developing across South America. The newly closed canopy created environments that had scarcely existed before. Layers of vegetation stacked one above another. Branch networks connected distant trees. Fruits became abundant as flowering plants spread through the forest. Light, moisture, and food resources varied dramatically from the forest floor to the upper crown. These conditions rewarded a different set of abilities than those favored in the older, more open ecosystems. Animals capable of moving confidently through branches gained access to resources unavailable on the ground. Grasping hands became valuable. Forward-facing eyes improved depth perception among tangled limbs. Greater spatial awareness helped individuals navigate increasingly complex environments. Memory, flexibility, and behavioral innovation carried practical advantages in a habitat where opportunities existed in 3 dimensions. Many mammalian groups began exploiting these conditions, but the forest itself acted as the selective force. Generation after generation, the environment favored traits suited to life among branches, leaves, flowers, and fruit. The rainforest was becoming more than a place where mammals lived. It was shaping the direction of their evolution. Across millions of years, the intricate architecture of the post-extinction forest exerted pressures unlike those found in the Cretaceous world. Within that living maze, intelligence, dexterity, and social complexity gained increasing value. The consequences would echo through countless lineages, long after the asteroid itself had become a distant memory, preserved only in stone. High above the recovering forest floor, among networks of branches that had not existed in earlier tropical worlds, a small group of mammals began exploring opportunities created by the transformed canopy. Their story occupied only a tiny corner of the broader recovery, yet its consequences would stretch across tens of millions of years. The animals were plesiadapiforms, members of a lineage often described as stem primates. Fossils indicate that they appeared astonishingly soon after the extinction event, within roughly 105,000 to 139,000 years of the boundary itself. On geological timescales, this was almost immediate. The world was still adjusting to the disappearance of the old order when these mammals began diversifying into newly available ecological spaces. They would not have looked familiar to a modern observer. Most were small creatures, probably resembling oversized shrews more than monkeys or apes. Their bodies retained many primitive features inherited from earlier mammalian ancestors, yet hidden within those modest forms were traits that would prove increasingly useful in the forests taking shape around them. Some possessed grasping extremities capable of navigating irregular surfaces. Eye placement was beginning to favor improved depth perception. Their diets often included fruit, seeds, and other resources associated with flowering plants. None of these characteristics appeared fully developed. Each existed as an early version, a rough draft awaiting millions of years of refinement. The significance of those traits becomes clearer when viewed against the structure of the emerging rainforest. A closed canopy creates a world arranged vertically. Food can appear above, below, beside, or far beyond the next branch. Distances must be judged accurately. Movement requires coordination and balance. Fruit does not remain available in a single location, but appears in scattered patches that reward memory and exploration. Every journey through such an environment becomes a sequence of spatial decisions. Under those conditions, even small improvements can provide meaningful advantages. An animal capable of judging distance more precisely reaches food more efficiently. One able to grip securely spends less energy recovering from mistakes. A flexible diet allows survival when preferred resources become scarce. Selection acts on these differences generation after generation, preserving useful variations and gradually building more specialized adaptations. The tropical forests spreading across South America supplied exactly the setting where such pressures could accumulate. Flowering plants filled the canopy with new food sources. Interconnected crowns offered pathways through the upper layers of vegetation. Complex habitats rewarded behavioral flexibility in ways that more open ecosystems often did not. The forest therefore served as more than shelter. It became an active participant in evolution, shaping which traits succeeded and which disappeared. The architecture of the canopy guided countless small decisions made by animals moving through it, and those decisions influenced survival, reproduction, and inheritance. Viewed from a sufficient distance, a remarkable chain emerges. The impact altered the vegetation. The vegetation reshaped the forest. The forest changed the challenges faced by mammals. Those challenges favored characteristics associated with the earliest primates. The connection is neither direct nor simple, yet it remains difficult to ignore. A sequence that began with a single morning of destruction eventually produced conditions in which a primate lineage could take root and flourish. The branches growing across the post-extinction rainforest carried far more than leaves. They carried possibilities that had never existed before. There was no single moment when the transformation became obvious. No boundary in the rock marks the instant it happened. The shift emerged gradually through millions of years as countless organisms interacted, adapted, spread, and altered the world around them. At some point during the Paleocene and into the Eocene, The recovering rainforest crossed a threshold. Beyond it, the forest was no longer merely rebuilding. It had become a system capable of accelerating its own complexity. In the earlier stages of recovery, each species established itself against difficult odds. Populations expanded into available territory. Ecological relationships formed cautiously, one connection at a time. Many habitats remained relatively simple. Disturbances could still erase local communities before they became firmly established. The legacy of extinction lingered in the structure of the ecosystem. As diversity increased, a different dynamic began to emerge. New arrivals no longer occupied empty space alone. Their presence created opportunities for additional organisms. A flowering plant attracted a pollinating insect. That insect became prey for another animal. The plant's fallen leaves altered the soil. Different microbes prospered in the changing chemistry. Roots formed partnerships with fungi. Each addition expanded the number of possible interactions available to future species. The process resembled a network weaving itself outward from every connection. A tree producing a novel fruit offered nourishment for animals capable of eating it. Those animals carried seeds into new territory. New groves appeared. Fresh habitat became available for insects, birds, fungi, and microorganisms. Diversity generated conditions that encouraged even more diversity. Forest structure contributed another layer of opportunity. As vegetation occupied different heights, organisms began specializing within particular zones. Some species spent nearly their entire lives in the canopy. Others occupied the dim middle layers. Certain plants adapted to brief flashes of sunlight reaching the forest floor. Distinct communities emerged within the same patch of forest, stacked vertically and linked through countless ecological exchanges. The scale reached by this process is difficult to grasp. Today, a single square kilometer of Amazon rainforest can contain more than 1,000 species of trees. In some locations, 1 hectare supports roughly 300 tree species. Researchers have documented individual trees hosting dozens of ant species simultaneously, each exploiting different resources, territories, and microhabitats within the same living structure. The pattern extends into rivers, wetlands, and floodplains. A single Amazonian river system may contain more fish species than all the rivers of Europe combined. Every branch of the ecosystem reflects the same underlying principle. Diversity generates opportunity, and opportunity generates additional diversity. Geography alone cannot explain such richness. Climate contributes, time contributes, size contributes, yet the deeper story lies in compounding interactions accumulated across roughly 60 million years. Each successful lineage altered the environment inherited by the next. Each ecological innovation expanded the number of pathways available for evolution to explore. The Amazon, therefore, became something more than a repository of life. It evolved into a biological engine, continuously producing new niches, new relationships, and new possibilities. For millions of years, the system has continued building upon itself, layer after layer, connection after connection, growing denser and more intricate with the passing ages. From orbit, the Amazon appears as a green expanse stretched across much of northern South America. Yet scale alone does not explain its significance. By the time the rainforest reached its modern dimensions, it had become something more than an ecosystem. It had become part of the machinery of the planet itself, woven into cycles that connect atmosphere, land, water, and life. Its influence begins with carbon. Across roughly 6 million square kilometers, trees, roots, soils, fungi, and countless other organisms store an extraordinary quantity of organic material. Collectively, the forest contains carbon equivalent to approximately 15 to 20 years of total human carbon emissions. That carbon is not concentrated in one place. It is distributed through trunks, branches, leaf litter, peat, sediments, and living tissues spread across the basin. Every day, sunlight enters this system and powers photosynthesis. Leaves draw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and transform it into wood, roots, fruits, and seeds. Across the entire forest, the cumulative effect is immense. Scientists estimate that the Amazon removes roughly 1.2 billion metric tons of carbon from the atmosphere each year, making it the most influential terrestrial carbon processing system on Earth. Its role extends far beyond carbon storage. Water circulates through the forest on a scale that reshapes weather across continents. Moisture lifted from roots travels upward through leaves and enters the atmosphere, joining the immense aerial currents discussed earlier. These atmospheric rivers move across South America, redistributing water far from the basin where it originated. Rainfall reaching agricultural regions, grasslands, and major population centers is linked in part to moisture recycled through Amazonian vegetation. Cities such as Sao Paulo and Buenos Aires receive precipitation influenced by processes occurring thousands of kilometers away within the rainforest. The connection is invisible from the ground, yet it operates continuously. Climate models offer a glimpse of a world in which this system no longer functions at full strength. Temperatures rise across large regions. Rainfall patterns shift. Drought becomes more frequent in areas that currently depend upon transported moisture. Carbon accumulates more rapidly in the atmosphere. Atlantic weather systems respond to altered patterns of heat and evaporation. Changes spread outward through networks that connect continents and oceans. Such findings reveal a deeper truth about the rainforest. Its importance does not emerge solely from the number of species it contains. Diversity is part of the story, yet the forest's greatest achievement may be the stability it provides. Through millions of years of ecological accumulation, countless organisms collectively constructed a system capable of influencing planetary processes. Ocean currents help regulate global temperature. Polar ice affects sea level, reflectivity, and circulation. The Amazon belongs within that same category of earth-shaping infrastructure. It is a biological structure operating at continental scale. Seen through the lens of deep time, the sequence remains astonishing. An impact that ended one world initiated conditions that eventually produced another. Forests expanded, diversified, altered rivers, transformed climates, and accumulated enough influence to affect the functioning of the planet itself. What emerged from that long chain of events was more than a rainforest. It was a living system integrated into Earth's balance, one of the mechanisms through which the planet maintains the conditions that countless species, including our own, depend upon. The history of the Amazon is often told as a story of abundance, yet endurance may be the more remarkable theme. Across the tens of millions of years since the forest first emerged from the aftermath of extinction, the planet has continued changing around it. Temperatures have risen and fallen, continents have shifted position, rivers have altered course, oceans have advanced and retreated. Through each transformation, the forest has been tested again and again. One of the most severe challenges arrived roughly 56 million years ago during the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. Over a geologically brief interval, enormous quantities of carbon entered the atmosphere and oceans. Global temperatures climbed by approximately 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. Ecosystems across the planet faced environmental conditions unlike those that had existed only a short time before. The tropical forests of South America did not emerge unchanged from that episode. Species distributions shifted. Some communities contracted, others expanded into newly favorable regions. Ecological relationships were reorganized. Fossil evidence suggests substantial turnover among plants and animals, yet the forest itself persisted. Its structure adapted to altered conditions, and life continued finding pathways through the disruption. Many millions of years later, a different challenge arrived from the opposite direction. During the ice ages of the Pleistocene, global climates cooled considerably. Ice sheets expanded across high latitudes. Rainfall patterns changed. Large portions of the tropics became drier than they are today. Areas once covered by continuous rainforest fragmented into isolated refugia, separated by stretches of grassland and more open habitats. These refugia functioned as biological reservoirs. Within them, populations survived while surrounding regions became less hospitable. Isolation produced an unexpected consequence. Groups of organisms cut off from one another began following separate evolutionary trajectories. Small genetic differences accumulated across generations. Distinct species emerged, where once there had been a single population. When climates warmed again and forests expanded outward, those lineages encountered one another as separate species. In this way, periods of contraction may have contributed to the astonishing diversity that later characterized the Amazon. Difficulty became a source of innovation. Geological processes presented additional tests. South America continued drifting through deep time, while the uplift of the Andes reshaped drainage patterns across the continent. River systems were reorganized. Wetlands expanded and disappeared. Sea levels fluctuated, periodically altering the boundaries between land and water. Volcanic activity affected regional environments. Through every transition, ecological communities adjusted and reassembled. A common thread runs through these episodes. The Amazon's resilience does not depend upon any single species, river, or habitat. It emerges from the immense variety embedded within the system. When conditions become unfavorable in one region, survival continues elsewhere. When one lineage declines, others persist. Diversity creates redundancy, and redundancy creates stability. Across roughly 65 million years, that structure proved extraordinarily effective. Climatic upheavals, geological reorganizations, and environmental disturbances repeatedly challenged the rainforest without erasing it. Recovery did not always occur quickly. Sometimes it unfolded across spans of time longer than the existence of entire animal groups. Yet recovery remained possible because foundations endured. The forest that exists today carries the memory of those countless trials. Its roots extend through episodes of warming and cooling, fragmentation and expansion, loss and renewal. For millions upon millions of years, resilience built through diversity was sufficient to carry the system forward, preserving one of the most intricate living networks ever assembled on Earth. A warning does not always arrive as a single dramatic event. Sometimes it appears first at the edge of a system, in one region, through changes that seem manageable when viewed individually. Across the southern Amazon, those changes have been accumulating for decades, creating a picture that scientists study with increasing attention. Stretching across portions of Mato Grosso, Pará, and Rondônia, this region has experienced the greatest concentration of deforestation in the basin. Forest has been cleared for agriculture, cattle ranching, roads, and expanding settlements. The transformation has unfolded across a landscape that once formed part of an almost continuous canopy. Seen from orbit, the pattern resembles a widening network of openings spreading into previously intact forest. The consequences extend far beyond the cleared areas themselves. Trees influence the movement of moisture, the formation of clouds, and the timing of rainfall. When enough forest is removed, those relationships begin to shift. Measurements collected over recent decades indicate that the dry season in the southern Amazon has lengthened by roughly 4 to 5 weeks compared with historical conditions. A change measured in weeks may appear modest, yet for ecosystems adapted to reliable seasonal rhythms, it represents a substantial alteration. Vegetation experiences longer periods without replenishing rain. Streams shrink earlier in the year. Soil moisture declines more deeply before the wet season returns. Under such conditions, fires become easier to ignite and more difficult to contain. Fire introduces a challenge unlike many of the disturbances the rainforest faced across deep time. Most Amazonian ecosystems did not evolve alongside frequent burning. Their trees possess relatively little protection against repeated exposure to flames. When fire passes through intact forest, damage often continues long after the smoke disappears. Canopies open. Temperatures rise near the ground. Moisture escapes more readily into the atmosphere. Recovery becomes increasingly difficult when drought and fire occur together. Areas that once supported complex rainforest communities may regenerate into vegetation with fewer species, lower biomass, and reduced capacity to recycle water. Each degraded patch contributes slightly less moisture to the broader atmospheric system that sustains surrounding forests. Scientists have searched for ways to measure these changes objectively. Satellite observations provide one important tool. By tracking how vegetation responds after droughts, heat waves, and fire events, researchers can estimate resilience, the ability of an ecosystem to return toward its previous condition following disturbance. Across much of the Amazon, studies indicate that resilience has been declining for at least 2 decades. Forests are still recovering after environmental stress, yet the process increasingly requires more time. This pattern matters because slowing recovery is often regarded by systems scientists as an early signal of instability. A system may appear functional while gradually losing the flexibility that once allowed it to absorb shocks. Several modeling studies suggest portions of the southern Amazon may already be approaching local thresholds, beyond which feedbacks begin reinforcing degradation. Reduced forest cover can produce less rainfall. Reduced rainfall can weaken forest health. Weaker forests become more vulnerable to fire and drought, encouraging further decline. The southern Amazon does not yet represent the entire basin. Large regions remain remarkably resilient. Still, this landscape offers a glimpse of a possible trajectory, a living preview of how a self-sustaining system can begin to struggle when the conditions that supported it for millions of years are progressively altered. A forest can appear whole even while approaching a boundary that cannot be seen directly. Rivers still flow, trees still flower, rain still falls. The system continues performing the functions that define it. Yet beneath those familiar patterns, the balance sustaining them may be shifting toward a critical threshold. Researchers studying the Amazon use the term tipping point to describe that threshold. It marks the moment when gradual change gives way to self-reinforcing transformation. Before crossing it, disturbances can be absorbed and recovery remains possible. Beyond it, the mechanisms that once supported stability begin driving decline instead. Determining the exact location of that boundary is difficult. Forests are not machines built from identical parts. Soil conditions differ from region to region. Rainfall patterns vary across thousands of kilometers. Human activity affects some areas more heavily than others. For these reasons, scientists estimate the tipping point within a range rather than assigning a single number. Current research places that range somewhere between 20 and 40% total deforestation, combined with approximately 2 to 4 degrees Celsius of warming. The breadth of the estimate reflects genuine uncertainty about where the threshold sits, while substantial evidence indicates that a threshold exists. Today, roughly 17 to 20% of the Amazon has already been cleared. At the same time, global temperatures have risen by approximately 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre industrial averages. Neither figure alone guarantees collapse. Together, they place the system closer to conditions that concern climate scientists, ecologists, and Earth system researchers. A major study published in Nature during 2024 examined multiple interacting pressures across the basin. Its findings suggested that between 10 and 47% of Amazonian forests could experience critical stress conditions by the middle of this century. Those conditions include drought, warming, altered rainfall patterns, and human disturbance occurring simultaneously rather than independently. The mathematics behind the danger is straightforward in structure, even when its details are complex. Forest cover supports transpiration. Transpiration contributes moisture to the atmosphere. Atmospheric moisture helps generate rainfall. Rainfall sustains vegetation. Healthy vegetation maintains forest cover. As long as this cycle remains strong, the system reinforces itself in a productive direction. When enough forest disappears, each stage begins supplying less support to the next. Reduced tree cover means less water entering the air. Less atmospheric moisture can translate into weaker rainfall. Drier conditions increase stress on vegetation. Stressed vegetation becomes more vulnerable to drought and fire. Additional forest loss follows, feeding the cycle once again. What makes tipping points significant is that they do not require a new external shock once the feedback loop gains momentum. The system itself begins carrying the process forward. The implications extend far beyond the basin. The Amazon stores carbon accumulated across millions of years within living biomass, roots, soils, and decaying organic matter. Estimates place that reservoir at an amount roughly equivalent to 15 to 20 years of present human carbon emissions. Large-scale forest decline would gradually return much of that stored carbon to the atmosphere, amplifying warming already underway. Viewed across deep time, the contrast is striking. A sequence of events set in motion after the asteroid impact required millions of years to rebuild tropical ecosystems and tens of millions more to generate the complexity visible today. Some scientific models suggest the threshold threatening that achievement could be approached within the span of a single human lifetime. Consider the span of time carried within a single patch of rainforest. A tree stands among thousands of others. Insects move through its branches. Fungi thread through the soil below. Birds transport seeds across distances measured in kilometers. None of these relationships appeared all at once. Each emerged through a sequence of events, stretching back across millions of years, layer added upon layer, until the forest became what it is today. The history traced throughout this story reveals an imbalance that is difficult to grasp intuitively. The Amazon required extraordinary stretches of time to assemble itself. Following the asteroid impact, plant diversity did not rebound immediately. Roughly 6 million years passed before tropical ecosystems recovered comparable levels of diversity. Another 60 million years of ecological accumulation followed, producing the intricate system that now covers much of northern South America. Those figures describe construction. Construction proceeds through succession, adaptation, cooperation, competition, extinction, and innovation. A new species enters an environment and establishes itself. Interactions form with pollinators, predators, parasites, decomposers, and neighbors. Over generations, those connections deepen. Additional opportunities emerge. New ecological roles become possible. Complexity grows incrementally, one relationship at a time. The pace of breakdown follows different rules. Complex systems depend on countless connections operating simultaneously. Their strength comes from the density of those relationships. That same characteristic creates vulnerability when many links are disrupted together. A web can tolerate the loss of individual strands. Remove enough strands at once, and the structure no longer supports itself in the same way. Ecologists observe this pattern across ecosystems. Coral reefs may require thousands of years to develop, yet deteriorate rapidly under sustained stress. Soil communities build fertility gradually through biological activity and weathering, while erosion can remove that accumulated richness in a comparatively brief interval. Forests follow a similar principle. The asymmetry arises from structure itself. Building requires successful sequencing. Each component must arrive, persist, and interact with others before the next layer can emerge. Collapse does not require reversing every step individually. It requires enough essential relationships to weaken within a sufficiently short period. After the asteroid, recovery unfolded during a span of relative stability measured in millions of years. Surviving species encountered opportunities to spread, diversify, and establish new ecological partnerships. Forest architecture changed, nutrient cycles strengthened, climate interactions matured, biodiversity compounded through repeated generations. Present pressures operate on a markedly different timetable. Deforestation, fragmentation, fire, and rapid atmospheric warming have intensified within decades. From an evolutionary perspective, decades pass almost instantaneously. Adaptation remains possible, yet many ecological mechanisms function across centuries or millennia. Genetic change, species migration, and ecosystem reorganization generally proceed far more gradually than contemporary environmental transformation. This difference in tempo may be the most consequential number in the entire narrative. 66 million years were required to produce the system surrounding the Amazon today. The processes threatening portions of that system have unfolded within a fraction of that duration. Seen through the lens of deep time, the contrast becomes striking. The forest represents accumulated history preserved within roots, rivers, soils, climates, and living communities. Its existence reflects an immense sequence of successful connections. The possibility of loss emerges through a much shorter chain, one measured not in geological eras but in human generations. The imbalance between creation and destruction is not unique to the Amazon. It is one of the defining characteristics of complexity itself. A forest that has existed for 66 million years accumulates more than species. It accumulates experience. Every drought, climatic shift, volcanic episode, and ecological disruption leaves traces behind, shaping the capacities that allow survival during the next challenge. The Amazon carries that history within its living structure. For this reason, the story cannot be understood solely through the lens of vulnerability. The same system that now faces mounting pressures is also one of the most resilient biological networks ever assembled. Its resilience does not emerge from strength in any single organism, river, or habitat. It emerges from abundance, diversity, and redundancy distributed across an immense landscape. Ecologists often describe redundancy as one of the foundations of stability. In a simple system, the loss of a critical component may cause immediate failure. In a highly diverse system, multiple species often perform overlapping ecological functions. If one declines, others may continue carrying out similar roles. Pollination, seed dispersal, decomposition, nutrient cycling, and countless other processes are supported by numerous organisms rather than a single indispensable actor. This characteristic has helped the Amazon persist through extraordinary environmental upheavals. When climatic conditions shifted, some populations declined, while others expanded. When habitats contracted, refuges remained. When local ecosystems were disrupted, surviving communities provided sources for recolonization. Diversity acted as a form of ecological memory, preserving possibilities for recovery even during difficult periods. The principle remains relevant today. Although resilience has weakened in portions of the basin, weakening is not equivalent to disappearance. Scientists studying forest dynamics consistently note that many trends respond to changes in human pressure. Reduced rates of deforestation can improve ecological outcomes. Fire prevention can protect vulnerable regions. Habitat connectivity can strengthen species movement and genetic exchange. Recovery processes remain active where conditions allow them to operate. Research examining tipping point risks frequently includes an important qualification. The Amazon as a whole has not crossed the threshold that concerns Earth system scientists. Warnings are serious precisely because the future remains uncertain. A threshold already passed would require a different conversation. The existence of uncertainty means trajectories are still influenced by decisions made in the present. Another source of resilience exists in the people who have lived within the forest for generations. Across the Amazon basin, hundreds of indigenous communities maintain cultural traditions closely connected to local ecosystems. Numerous studies have found that territories under indigenous stewardship often experience lower deforestation rates and retain higher levels of biodiversity than many surrounding regions. Knowledge accumulated through long relationships with rivers, plants, soils, and wildlife has become part of the forest's continuing story. The broader history of the Amazon provides perspective as well. It endured the asteroid that reshaped tropical life. It persisted through the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, one of the most significant warming events of the Cenozoic era. It adapted repeatedly as climatic cycles transformed conditions across continents. None of those episodes left the forest unchanged, yet each demonstrated a remarkable capacity for renewal. That capacity remains embedded within the system today. Roots continue binding soil. Seeds continue traveling across rivers and through animal movements. Forest fragments continue regenerating when disturbance recedes. Ecological relationships formed across millions of years remain active, waiting for opportunities to expand again. The Amazon's future has not been written. Its history contains warnings, yet it also contains evidence of endurance on a scale few ecosystems can match. The same long story that explains its vulnerability also explains why possibilities for recovery still exist. There is a moment when looking across deep time, when two distant events begin to resemble one another in outline. They remain profoundly different in cause, scale, and circumstance, yet certain patterns echo across millions of years. The comparison is worth making carefully because it reveals something about how ecosystems respond to rapid change. 66 million years ago, a forested world encountered an environmental shock that arrived faster than evolution could accommodate. Species had adapted to one set of conditions, one climate, one network of relationships. Then those conditions shifted with extraordinary speed. Food webs fractured, habitats transformed. Survival became unevenly distributed across the landscape. The present era contains a similar structural challenge. The issue is not that modern events replicate the asteroid impact. Nothing occurring today resembles a mountain-sized object striking Earth. The similarity emerges elsewhere, in the pace at which environmental conditions are being altered relative to the biological systems attempting to respond. Forests are built through relationships. Trees depend on soils shaped by microorganisms. Pollinators depend on flowering cycles. Animals depend on fruiting seasons, water availability, shelter, migration routes, and countless interactions that connect one species to another. Stability emerges from those connections operating within familiar environmental boundaries. When temperature patterns shift, rainfall changes, or habitats become fragmented, those relationships come under strain. A species may survive physically while losing the conditions required for successful reproduction. A pollinator may persist while becoming disconnected from the plants it once serviced. Ecological disruption often begins in links before it becomes visible in losses. The asteroid era demonstrated how rapidly such disruptions can spread through a system. Conditions changed, and organisms faced pressures for which no previous adaptation existed. Some lineages disappeared, others endured. Entire ecological communities reorganized themselves around a new reality. A comparable challenge confronts many modern ecosystems. Forests, coral reefs, wetlands, and grasslands are experiencing environmental shifts measured in decades rather than geological epochs. Biological adaptation remains possible, yet evolution operates through generations. The speed of environmental change becomes part of the story. One distinction separates the two events in a fundamental way. The asteroid arrived without intention, awareness, or choice. Physical laws carried it toward Earth long before any organism could influence the outcome. Nothing within the biosphere possessed the capacity to alter its trajectory. The forces affecting the Amazon today belong to a different category. Deforestation rates can rise or fall. Land management practices can change. Emissions can increase, stabilize, or decline. Policies can be revised. Technologies can be adopted. Decisions accumulate, producing consequences that move ecosystems toward one future or another. This difference does not erase the seriousness of the challenge. If anything, it sharpens it. The forest cannot negotiate directly with atmospheric carbon, chainsaws, roads, or fire. Responses emerge through human choices interacting with ecological systems. Looking across the gulf between the asteroid impact and the present reveals an uncomfortable mirror. Both periods involve environmental change, arriving at a pace that tests the limits of adaptation. One event unfolded beyond the influence of life itself. The other exists within a sphere where action remains possible. That distinction does not guarantee a particular outcome. It does, however, leave open a path that did not exist on the morning the asteroid fell. A forest can be measured in species counts, rainfall cycles, carbon storage, river discharge, and genetic diversity. Science excels at describing those realities with precision. Yet, after following the Amazon across tens of millions of years, another layer of the story emerges, one that sits alongside the data and asks something deeper about how change unfolds across Earth's history. The impact at the end of the Cretaceous was among the most destructive events complex life has ever experienced. Entire branches of the tree of life vanished. Roughly three-quarters of all species disappeared. Creatures that had dominated land, sea, and sky for immense stretches of time were gone. Ecosystems assembled through 180 million years of evolution unraveled within a geological instant. Nothing about that loss becomes smaller when viewed from the present. The vanished world possessed its own richness, its own relationships, its own living architecture. Forests spread across continents. Oceans carried communities unlike any that would follow. Every extinct lineage represented a unique solution to existence, shaped through countless generations and never repeated. The story could have ended there, as a narrative of absence. Instead, the surviving fragments continued onward. Seeds persisted, insects endured. Small mammals found pathways through altered landscapes. Fungi, microbes, and flowering plants carried forward pieces of a biological inheritance that had not been completely erased. From those survivors emerged possibilities that had never previously existed. The layered tropical forest that eventually spread across South America was not waiting in the wings of history. It was not destined to appear. It arose through a chain of contingencies, each dependent on circumstances created by the extinction itself. New ecological opportunities opened, novel relationships formed. Species encountered conditions unlike those experienced by their ancestors. Within those forests, fruit-bearing plants expanded their influence. Arboreal mammals adapted to increasingly complex environments. Early primate relatives navigated branches shaped by evolutionary pressures that belonged to this transformed world. Far downstream in time, every monkey, ape, and human inherited part of that legacy. Seen from this perspective, the Amazon carries an unusual message. Earth's history does not move toward a predetermined destination. It does not advance along a straight line from simple to complex, nor does it decline steadily from some lost golden age. Life responds to circumstance. It experiments. It reshapes itself around survival, opportunity, and chance. That understanding does not turn catastrophe into something desirable. Mourning and creation can occupy the same story. A vanished world remains worthy of grief even when another rises afterward. The existence of the Amazon does not redeem the extinction that preceded it. Both realities stand together. Deep time reveals a planet in continual transformation. Species appear and disappear, continents drift, climates shift, ecosystems reorganize themselves around whatever conditions endure. Across those changes, life repeatedly assembles new forms from surviving pieces. The Amazon stands as one of the clearest examples of that process. Its rivers, forests, insects, mammals, and millions of interwoven relationships trace their origins to an event that once seemed only destructive. In that sense, the forest offers evidence for a profound scientific truth. Creation and destruction are woven into the same fabric of planetary history. Across millions of years, each leaves traces that shape what follows. Try, for a moment, to hold a sequence in your mind, not a list of events, but a chain. Each link touches the next. Each consequence becomes a cause. Stretch that chain backward through history, beyond civilizations, beyond humanity, beyond mammals, until it disappears into a world that no longer exists. The beginning of this particular chain lies far from Earth. In the early solar system, fragments of rock, metal, ice, and dust circled the young Sunday collisions assembled planets. Other collisions shattered them. Among the debris was a carbon rich asteroid, a remnant of planetary construction carrying the chemical signature of that distant era. For millions of years, it followed an orbit shaped by gravity alone. No living thing observed its passage. No forest, animal, or ocean altered its course. Eventually, that trajectory intersected with Earth. The impact transformed the future in a matter of moments. A forested world entered crisis. Darkness spread through the atmosphere. Ecological networks that had persisted across immense spans of time began to fail. Species vanished. Familiar relationships disappeared. The dominant architecture of the Cretaceous biosphere came apart. Yet the chain did not end. Flowering plants endured where many conifers declined. Nutrients entered recovering soils. New ecological opportunities emerged from damaged landscapes. Forests reorganized themselves around survivors, carrying different biological advantages. Layer by layer, generation by generation, a new tropical world took shape. The canopy thickened. Legumes altered soil fertility. Insects diversified into specialized partnerships. Rivers changed their behavior as root systems stabilized their banks. Moisture cycles strengthened. Biodiversity accumulated through countless interactions repeated across millions of years. Each development created conditions for another. Mammals expanded into ecological roles that had once been inaccessible. Some adapted to life among branches. Depth perception became increasingly useful. Grasping hands gained value. Flexible diets opened opportunities within fruit rich environments. Small changes accumulated through evolutionary time, preserving certain traits while discarding others. From those lineages emerged primates. The chain continued across continents, climates, and epochs. Species appeared and disappeared. Ice ages came and went. Mountains rose. Rivers shifted course. Forests contracted and expanded. Through every transformation, inheritance passed forward, carrying traces of earlier worlds into later ones. Much later, roughly 300,000 years ago, a primate species emerged in Africa possessing an unusual capacity for symbolic thought, memory, language, and imagination. That species eventually spread across the planet. It learned to examine fossils, measure isotopes, sequence genomes, and reconstruct events separated from it by tens of millions of years. Viewed from enough distance, the sequence becomes difficult to ignore. The asteroid impact influenced the forests that followed. Those forests influenced the evolution of primates. The evolution of primates eventually produced minds capable of asking how any of it happened. Every person forms part of that continuity. There was no blueprint directing the process. No destination existed at the beginning. The chain unfolded through physical laws, biological inheritance, chance events, and survival. One consequence opened the possibility for another, again and again across 66 million years. Perhaps the most extraordinary link is the final one. A piece of rock from deep space helped shape conditions that eventually produced a mind capable of looking backward through time and understanding the chain itself. The story and the observer emerged from the same sequence of events, connected by an unbroken line of consequence stretching across the ages. There is a perspective from which everything we have discussed disappears. The pollen records vanish. The isotope measurements vanish. The satellite images, climate models, fossil leaves, and scientific papers all fall away. The long chain of reconstruction that carried us backward through 66 million years dissolves, leaving only the forest itself. The Amazon does not know it has a history. It does not know that its origins trace back to an extinction event that reshaped life across the planet. It does not know that an asteroid struck the Yucatan and altered the future of every ecosystem that followed. It does not know that researchers spent years examining rock layers, counting fossil pollen grains, and comparing ancient leaves in order to understand how it came to be. Knowledge belongs elsewhere. The forest continues its work without awareness of the story surrounding it. Roots move through soil in search of water and nutrients. Leaves unfold toward available light. Fungi exchange resources with plants. Insects follow chemical signals. Seeds travel outward through wind, water, and animals. Rivers carry sediment toward the sea. Clouds gather, release rain, and return again. None of these processes require understanding. The Amazon does not know that it contains roughly 1 in every 10 known species on Earth. It does not know that individual plots of land can hold tree diversity exceeding that of entire continents. It does not know that scientists describe it as one of the most complex biological systems ever assembled. Complexity exists whether it is recognized or not. Across the basin, countless interactions continue every hour. A fruit falls, a fish consumes a seed, a bird transports pollen, a beetle feeds within bark, a fungus breaks down wood. Nutrients return to circulation. New growth emerges from old growth. The network sustains itself through relationships built across immense stretches of time. Nor does the forest know anything about thresholds. It does not know that researchers measure resilience. It does not know that rainfall patterns are monitored from space. It does not know that models estimate future risks. The trees do not debate deforestation rates. The rivers do not calculate atmospheric carbon. The canopy does not anticipate tomorrow. Life proceeds according to the conditions it encounters. For tens of millions of years, the system has done what living systems do. It has occupied available space, formed partnerships, adapted to changing circumstances, and generated new opportunities for the organisms within it. Generation followed generation, species followed species. The process continued through warming events, climatic shifts, changing river systems, and periods of contraction and expansion. That continuity remains visible today. The forest still grows. Water still cycles through roots, leaves, clouds, and rainfall. Organisms continue finding ways to live within the structure inherited from countless ancestors. The self-building system remains active, assembling each day from millions of interactions occurring simultaneously across the landscape. Perhaps that is what makes the story so striking. The Amazon survived a rock from space. It helped shape the evolution of lineages that eventually produced minds capable of studying it. It became a subject of inquiry, measurement, and reflection. Yet none of that awareness belongs to the forest. The knowing is ours, and with that knowledge comes something the Amazon itself has never needed to possess: the ability to understand what it is, how it came to be, and what may happen next. Try for a moment to hold the scale of the story as a single object: a forest stretching across a continent, tens of millions of years of accumulated relationships, rivers carrying the memory of mountains, roots exchanging nutrients through networks too intricate to map completely, species arriving, adapting, diverging, and weaving themselves into an ever denser fabric of life. None of it appeared at once. Each layer depended on what came before. Each survivor inherited a world shaped by earlier survivors. Generation after generation added another thread, another partnership, another possibility. Time performed the construction patiently, with no awareness of the destination and no blueprint for the result. From the perspective of geology, the beginning was abrupt. A rock from space struck the Earth and ended a world that had persisted for longer than the existence of most mountain ranges alive today. Forests changed. Ecological hierarchies shifted. Opportunities appeared where barriers had stood. From the perspective of life, the rebuilding took almost forever. Millions of years passed before diversity returned. Millions more passed before ecological networks reached extraordinary density. The system expanded, reorganized itself, and continued accumulating complexity across spans of time so large that human history occupies only the thinnest fraction of the final chapter. Eventually, the Amazon became something larger than a collection of organisms. It became a process. Water rose from leaves and returned as rain. Carbon moved from air into wood, soil, and roots. Pollinators linked flowers separated by distance. Animals transported seeds beyond the reach of parent trees. Nutrients circulated through countless pathways. Every participant altered the conditions experienced by others. The forest became one of the mechanisms through which a living planet regulates itself. Today, that process remains active. The Amazon continues responding to the conditions around it exactly as it always has. It does not distinguish between natural pressures and human ones. It does not recognize intentions. It does not evaluate motives. It responds to temperature, rainfall, soil, disturbance, and opportunity. Expansion follows favorable conditions. Contraction follows unfavorable ones. Growth occurs where growth remains possible. That is how it worked after the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. That is how it works now. The difference lies elsewhere. The asteroid followed physics. It possessed no capacity for reflection. Gravity and momentum determined its path long before life appeared to observe the consequences. The environmental transformation that followed emerged from forces incapable of choosing another outcome. The pressures acting upon the Amazon today belong to a different category. They arise from decisions, technologies, institutions, economies, and behaviors. They are cumulative, but they are not inevitable. Their direction can change because the species creating them understands what is happening. That awareness may be the most unusual product of the entire chain of events. A forest helped shape a lineage. That lineage developed language, memory, science, and the ability to reconstruct deep time. Through those capacities, the Amazon has become more than a place. It has become a story that can be understood. And so, the final question does not come from the forest itself. The Amazon asks nothing. The weight rests with the minds that now know where it came from, how long it took to build, what it became, and what is at stake. The Amazon grew from the end of one world. What grows from this moment depends on what we do with the knowing.